guess. I like to have my guests introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their background and expertise first. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Matt, for the invitation to be part of your program. My name is Mahdi Al-Kaisi. I'm Professor Emeritus at Iowa State University. My area of research interest in soil physics, which is basically focused on the soil physical, chemical, and biological processes affecting the soil ecosystem surfaces. I focus in my research on soil carbon dynamics and greenhouse gas emission, how management practices used by the farmers influence these outcomes, whether increase greenhouse gas emission or decrease soil carbon content, for example, using tillage or additional nitrogen that could contribute to the degradation of soil biological and physical properties. So that's in essence to look into these processes and how they influence the outcome, namely the productivity of these different soils.
So your research has maybe become even more relevant than you had realized when you had started with all the climate change debate and the issues around carbon sequestration and all that. And that was where my interest in this topic came from as well. I was talking with, just talking with people about carbon sequestration and planting trees. And it occurred to me that maybe if the goal of carbon sequestration is to pull carbon out of the air, and that's how plants grow, is they pull carbon out of the air and store it in their bodies. I thought maybe we'd actually want something that grows faster, like grass. And then, the grass grows faster and faster, and then it dies and it piles up in the ground. But then I thought a little bit more, just take that next step and all right. So what happens in the soil then? It didn't seem like the soil just piled up forever and ever with this dead plant matter. That's just not my experience with soil, and it didn't make sense logically either, because you'd think, the plants would eventually pull all the carbon out of the air. So, I just realized how little I know about soil processes. Yeah, and it's really important, as I've learned in the carbon cycle and our climate change, and then of course agriculture and how we feed. It's very essential to all these processes that we have in our modern world.
I think your perception is correct, because not too many people understand, the soil formation and how the soil created. And that's a very complex process, because more than the general public or the lay person knew soil, they call it dirt. And that's basically the understanding of the soil, which is include biological, chemical, and physical process that's work on these geological formation like rocks, and that's one of the bedrocks under any soil. You see, when you go below the surface a meter or so, you will see these big rocks and gravels and all this. So the soil is a process of these, what we call weathering processes. And that's occurred during the glacial movement. And there is a different glacial movement over time. Some soil 14 to 11,000 years old, some of them 25 to 20. It depends on when the glacial movements start occurring and moving all these sediments from different rocks and break it down. So to accelerate and generate that soil to be as we know it now, there is 5 different factors involved in forming the soil, or what we call the skin of the earth, if you will. And these processes include These factors include what we call the parent materials, which is the geological formation. Then you have the time, climate, the biota or the organism, and then the topography. That's going to dictate all these factors integrated together. They don't work separately, but it work in an integration manner to create these fragments, what do we call it, soil, from the rocks, from the parent materials, which is different rocks form at different soils. So when you look at the soil, what constitutes soil? You have three major components for it. You have silt, sand, and clay. The larger particles is sand in size, then silt, and then the clay is very fine materials. These materials compose in a different proportion in a different regions in the world. If you are in a dry climate or if you have temperate climate, you have a different formation. And it depends on the water movement. When the water starts moving, the glacial start moving these sediments and distribute it on the landscape. So you see a different proportion of these different particles. The most efficient soil when you have a balanced proportion of these three components, sand, silt, and clay. Some soils dominated by clay, which is become poorly drained, very difficult to farm, and the waterlogging all the time. But if you have a medium mix in equal proportion or towards the sand and silt, you have a better water movement. You have better drainage moving in the soil. And that is going to influence how much organic matter this composition of the soil is going to store. If you go to the northern tier of the states, like in Minnesota and Iowa, North Dakota, you have rich organic matter soils. And that goes to the forming factors, which is the climate. So the cooler the temperature, you have more accumulation of organic matter because you have less burn of the organic materials you well stated initially, whether grasses or trees. So if you have soil dominated by grasses, that's the most rich soil, what we call the prairies. In the northern plains, in North Dakota, in Minnesota, in Iowa, in Ohio, most of the Midwest. Once we go down south, to and west, Colorado, Texas, you'll see kind of desert type climate, very low organic matter. You will see it in the soil. It doesn't hold much water because organic matter is critical to increase the ability of the soil to hold more water and store more water for the plants to grow. So these kind of in the nutshell, how the soil processes or these weathering processes form the soil as we know it now and formed thousands of years ago.
Mhm. Right, and I'm assuming the composition changes somewhat with depth, especially if there's grass or something decaying on top of it. I assume a lot of the carbon and decaying materials in that top layer, and then it gradually decreases as you go down, and there's some stratification in the soil.
Right. Generally, when you look at any soil in different regions, it'll be more noticeable when you go to the temperate climate. You will see the organic matter mostly accumulated in the top soil. And when you dig in the soil profile, what we call it, down deep to, let's say, 2-4 feet down, you will see a resolution of different organic matter concentration. And that's driven by the root system. And your early statement, you said, I assume grasses is better for the organic matter. You are correct, because most organic matter in most soils, generally in all soils, actually, it's highly concentrated under a grass formation-based vegetation. When you go into the tree formation, what they call the forest soils, is generally weathered soils. What we mean by weathered soil, it's really high reactive chemical and physical processes leach most of the organic matter. And two, most of the root system in the tree systems is not very extensive or fibrous like the grasses. So if you have a chance, I don't know if you have been in Minnesota or these areas, you see dark black soil. And basically that's because of the high volume of vegetation breakdown and decomposed to add more materials. As you go down in the soil profile, if you dig, some trench in the soil and look into it, you will see what we call different soil horizons on the very top. And that generally in the forest area, they call the O horizon, which is basically layer of organic matter. You go below that, you have what we call the A horizon. And that varied in depth between 6 to 12 inches in most soil. And that's the majority of the organic matter accumulated in that layer. Then you go between 12 to 24, that's what we call the B horizon. And that's basically mostly accumulated minerals and very small amount of organic matter. Then you go deeper, what we call the C horizon, at 3 feet or 4 feet. It's basically that's the raw materials that form the soil initially. And you don't see much of organic matter. Example, if you go very top, in some soils in the north, you have 5% organic matter, and that's pretty high. And you go down to the sea horizon, maybe less than 0.5%. So the organic matter concentration decrease as you go deep, and that's not by accident. One, the root system generally accumulated within the top 1 feet, about 50% of the root system. Then you go to the second feet, and that's probably you have 25% of the root system, and then dwindling down as you go deep. And this is why you see the high organic matter in the top layers of the soil, or they call it horizons. So that's the reason you see that distribution in the soil. But if you go in the forest area, you don't see that distinction. Probably you go and walk in the Rockies, you go on a trail, look, it's basically just one big layer, because the soil is what they call non-well developed soils because of lack of vegetation input from the trees. Most of the carbon in the forest is stored really in the trees, in the trunks. And the soil is very minimum amount there.
Okay. So let's talk about the agricultural part of this now. So now we have some understanding of the soil and how it's built. What kind of soils are we looking for, or are we trying to manufacture, I suppose, if we're trying to grow crops there and grow food?
Well, in what we call farmable land, agricultural land, and that varies in different degrees where you are. Let's take United States, where you are in the country. If you go to the northern tier of the country, you have the most richest soils actually in productivity, because high organic matter, deep soil, very uniform deep soil you will see, and high holding water capacity. And then the climate, you have more recharge of rainfall compared if you look into the southern tier or the western part of the state. So when you look in Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, other states, you see that what they call the arid or semi-arid climate. And their water holding capacity is very minimum and lack of organic matter, 1% or less. So when you look at the productivity, the highest productivity is going to be driven by these factors. So you see, for example, corn production or soybean production surpass the production if you go under normal condition, no irrigation, any production in the South. For example, in Iowa, you could have produced 200 bushels of corn, but if you go to Colorado, probably half of that you could produce. And that's because of these. One, the soil formation and the richness of the soil for nutrient cycling and the components of organic matter. Two, the water holding capacity, how long and how much the soil could hold the water to support the plants to produce. So these factors going to dictate the productivity. And good example of that, if you look, if you want to buy an acre in Iowa from a farmland, it could cost you between $8,000 to $10,000. And if you buy it in Colorado, probably cost you $3,000. That's the difference, what we call the land capacity to produce, a maximum productivity. And that's dictated by the soil formation and the soil richness of organic matter and nutrients driven from the organic matter to feed the crop through what we call nutrient cycling processes.
Okay, so I hear in the news a lot that it's a big problem for climate change and for different environmental reasons that people are cutting down forests for agricultural. They're replacing the forests with crops, and this is supposed to be a significant source of carbon emissions. I was just wondering if that's just because they need the land, or is there something about the soil that's especially good under forest, especially rainforests, I suppose. And does that actually contribute to the carbon in the atmosphere? If you're, I suppose if you're cutting down the trees, of course, those trees are then gonna, whatever you use them for. But if you're growing things, you're taking that carbon back out. And I guess I just want to say here, I want to introduce the carbon cycle in general, because when we talk about carbon in the atmosphere, we have to see where it comes from and where it goes. And the carbon in the soil, let me see here, it's very significant, at least for the terrestrial carbon. I looked up, it's 3 times the carbon that's in the atmosphere. So it's a lot, and 4 times if you total all the plants and animals and living things, they're mostly made of carbon. There's still a lot more of that carbon in the soil. So this is a really important thing to understand, the process of putting the carbon into the soil, if we want to understand the problem. But yeah, let's talk about the cutting the forest now.
Right. Well, that's an important issue, which is, when we go to the reason why, some change in land use involves some other countries. And that's basically, if you look in, Brazil and some other countries. And I visited Brazil many, many years ago and looked into, these new areas was added to the crop production, the growing corn and soybean. So basically, they're cutting some trees, replacing that with a new annual crops. There's a significant problem in changing land use. When you change land use, you're going to change the whole dynamic of carbon cycle. Trees add more stability, especially in those areas, where the soil generally is not highly a productive soil for crop production, like corn and soybean. So cutting the trees, basically, you're eliminating a big source for carbon sequestration because the trees stabilize and absorb more carbon, but these, especially, it has a certain period of time for 50 years and then plateau these trees as they mature. So, replacement, which is what they call forest management with the new trees, they have more capacity, active carbon absorption from the atmosphere to, secure it in the trees. And that's where the damage starts when you start cutting these trees and replace it with raw crops. With raw crops management like corn and soybean, farmers, they're going to use a lot of tillage. And most of the carbon generated from absorbing carbon from the atmosphere, if the soil keep tilled most of the time, every season they till the soil, you're going to release, oxidize the organic matter you accumulated over the growing season back into the atmosphere. So there is a feedback all the time. And that's where what they call the regenerative agriculture practices and crop production they use, or they call it climate smart agricultural practices, which is include, for example, no-till. And that's basically you don't till the soil, you leave the crop residue from previous season. The next season you come and drill and seed your crop into these residue and basically to keep that organic matter intact so you don't increase greenhouse gas emission. And that's most of the focus currently, and you probably heard that buzzword about regenerative agriculture, is to encourage farmers to minimize or eliminate tillage. And I did a lot of research in that topic, and the losses from tillage is significant. When you till the soil, basically you burn that organic matter, you energize the microbial community, start chewing on these raw materials, and the byproduct is going to be CO2 produced to the air. So changing land use from forest to agriculture, it's going to require a significant amount of input to produce a decent crop. And that's, you're going to need a lot of fertilizer. They use tillage, they use chemicals. All these, they have some kind of productive effect on the soil carbon sequestration process. Yet you eliminated a stable environment in the forest. And that's used significantly in Africa and some tropical areas, what they call agroforestry. And that's basically to integrate crop production like corn and soybean, wheat, and other row crops in setting of forests. And that's randomly organized around the farm or selectively organized. And that's, it has a significant impact environmentally and on the productivity, because forest is going to work significant impact on stabilizing soil, increasing the nutrient cycling, and reducing soil erosion, and protecting damage from extreme weather, extreme heat, or extreme flood, all these different elements. So that has been used by small farmers actually in Africa and other tropical areas to integrate crop production with the tree production. So the elimination of trees, it's a big setback if we want to maximize the carbon cycling and carbon capturing into the ecosystem. The soil, as you mentioned rightly, it has twice the capacity of the atmosphere to store carbon. But how we could store that amount of carbon? And that's where the extraterrestrial carbon sequestration include that combination of managing these forests more efficiently to maximize the withdrawal of CO2 from the atmosphere.
Okay. Let's linger on the farming practices and tilling for a bit. My understanding is, from what you just said, is that through that tilling process, you essentially make the soil more productive, more activity, but there's a less efficient use of, let's say, the soil resources, the nutrients and the carbon and all the things in the soil. Is my understanding correct there?
No, actually, tillage doesn't make it more productive.
Oh, okay.
Tillage is generally it's a mechanical disturbance of the soil. So you have a different tillage equipment. Farmers, after harvest, they use it, and they call chisel plow or moldboard plow or any other equipment. You are not familiar with it, or disc, just like, disc, gang of disc, on a machine go and disturb the soil. The belief by the farmers that will improve the soil. But all the research document, not just my research, by over decades, that tilling the soil is kind of counterproductive. It's going to destroy the soil structure, it's going to destroy the organic matter, because when you disturb the soil, break it down, basically you release that organic matter, especially the fresh organic matter you just accumulate during the growing season, and you'll be burned back to the air. And additional to that is going to destroy the physical structure of the soil, and that you don't have a good foundation to tolerate the big equipment traffic on the field. So that increase what we call the soil compaction. And that's very detrimental to the productivity. So, it's kind of snowballed these really negative effects on destroying the soil health, if you will, and destroy the soil structure. So that's what we trying to advise the farmers and try to demonstrate to them through our research, through our outreach, what's the best way to manage their fields without doing significant damage. Because if you look at the tillage, it's not just the mechanical damage to the soil, it's economically bad for the farmers. Because you drive your tractors with the tillage equipment, you spend about 3 gallons per acre of fuel. If you don't till, you save that. So that fuel is going to contribute to CO2, plus you have to pay for it. And with the current prices of the diesel and gas, that's very expensive input. So there is a lot of economics and environmental damages accumulated from managing the field with extensive tillage in most farms.
So is there any advantage to tilling? Because they've been using this as a farming process for hundreds or thousands of years even. There must be some advantage to doing it, I'm sure, right?
They used it in the past and generally, because if you go back to what they call the break in the sod, and that's if you heard about the Dust Bowl, which is in 1930 to 1933, something around that time, when the early settlers started breaking, most of the ground was in a prairie. And most of the settlers they want to produce food to survive. So they start converting all this back into row crops. So they use this extensive tillage. So they use that in the past. But that tradition continue, a lot of farmers continue with the tillage. It has some, you know, early evidence of value to help with the breaking of control, mechanical control of the weeds. For example, there are certain weeds, you go and disc them after the crop grow and you clean it so it doesn't compete with the crops. But nowadays, there's a lot of chemical controls for these weeds. And that it doesn't require really to go and till the ground and disturb it. And that's where, you know, the value of tillage become really minimum. Or people that use cover crop to compete with the weeds, suffocate them, and basically what they call the biological control. So there's a lot of modern agricultural practices. It doesn't necessarily require you use tillage. It maybe was necessary in the past, but in modern agriculture, I don't think has any value. And especially in the face of the climate change and the extreme weather events, we need to be very careful in managing these soils and how we use our smart management to overcome these challenges to mitigate climate change impact.
Okay. So how does the fertilizer or compost work then if you're not tilling it? Because I guess the point I thought of tilling was to turn the weeds under, get some oxygen in there and start decomposing some of that organic matter into those layers. So do you just, with this no-till farming, do you just pile organic matter on top of the soil then, and there's some other process to bring it down, or how does that work then?
We did several studies, and myself and my graduate student, on the breakdown of residue on the soil surface. And we look into how corn residue break with no-till, or if you use tillage, what we call conventional tillage. And we use litter bags and we put them in the field. Every 3 months, we go retrieve these bags, take them to the laboratory and do carbon and nitrogen analysis on them. And we look into different combination of residue. They call the GMO, the BT corn versus non-BT corn, because most of the farmers, they have the belief that BT corn stay longer on the field if you compare to non-GMO. And what we found, there is no significant difference between the two. Two, if you bury the residue, that's what they said, if you go till the residue or the weeds inside the soil will break down fast. What we found, that's not accurate as well. The residue break down in the same rate if you leave them on the surface or if you bury them in the ground. And that's for a simple reason, because residue decomposition or organic matter decomposition is governed by microbial activities, moisture, and temperature. These are the core factors that's going to influence the breakdown of these residue. If you go walk in a field in any farm, you see fresh residue on the surface. You come by the end of the season, you don't see much of these residue available, or very brittle and a breakdown. And that's because of these three factors. So that's a myth. You know, we need to till the residue and to break the residue. So the residue breakdown, or the manure, for example, for convenient people, they want to mix it with the soil to give them that sense of you will have a better breakdown. The essence of having a good distribution is to have a good equipment to distribute your manure or compost on the soil surface. So you have even cover on the soil surface, and instead of you have it piled in different areas. So it's a management issue rather than really scientific fact, how you use these different byproducts, animal byproducts or plant byproducts to improve the soil condition.
Okay, let's switch over. We've been talking a lot about carbon. Let's switch over to the other things that you care about in the soil and that plants need to grow. I'm thinking particularly nitrogen is the big one. There's other minerals that we need as well, but nitrogen is an interesting one because it comes from the air, basically the nitrogen that the plants use, and they have to convert it into some usable form. And that's a big deal with artificial fertilizers, right? It takes a lot of energy to produce these things. And yeah, so just could you explain to me what's the role of nitrogen in soils and how it gets there naturally, as opposed to all this artificial fertilizer that we've been producing for farmlands lately?
Right. Well, now, you are correct. Nitrogen is one of the basic or essential chemical elements for growing plants. To grow a massive biomass, you see these lush green, you need nitrogen. And then you have phosphorus and potassium, really that's for fruit formation, for grain formation, for roots development, and maximizing the plant vigor in the soil system. So nitrogen is a natural process. 78% of the air is nitrogen. So basically to draw that nitrogen naturally and fix it, you have to have a mechanism. And that's what they call it. You have microbial activities, nitrobacter, that's bacteria, in the soil system. Store that. For example, if you take any plant, especially the legumes like soybean, it have nodules on their root system. And that's where they pull the nitrogen gas from the air, form it in these nodules, and store it as organic nitrogen. That organic nitrogen, whether in the organic matter or in these nodules, it's need to be converted back what we call mineral nitrogen. And that mineral nitrogen become in the form what we call nitrate or ammonium. And these two forms exchange back from ammonium to nitrate, and that's nitrate, the form the plants will absorb, NO3. So most of the chemical fertilizer is built on forming ammonium by using natural gas and basically convert it to ammonium. So there's two forms or three forms of nitrogen the farmers use. They use it as a liquid, use it as dry, or use it as a gas, ammonia. So during the growing season, different people manage nitrogen differently. But the proper way to manage nitrogen is what we call it the split nitrogen. You don't put all the nitrogen in one time, that you split the nitrogen at different time in the growing season. So basically, if you look at the dry land management, that's what we call, depends on rainfall, we call dry land. Most of the farmers, they inject their nitrogen, what we call anhydrous ammonia, which is gas. And basically they inject it down deep in the soil about 4 inches. And when the temperature is below 50, Fahrenheit. When you inject it as ammonia, if the temperature above 50 is going to convert it back to ammonia, and basically it's going to be released as a gas back into the air. So to keep it intact, you need a cool temperature. So you don't inject your nitrogen when the temperature is 60 or 70. You need 50 or below. And that will stay, then there's microbial and chemical activities is going to convert that nitrogen, that ammonia back into nitrate, become available to the root system, then absorb it to the plants and feed it to produce the significant above ground biomass in case of corn or soybean, wheat, and any other crops. So that's in the nutshell how this nitrogen from the natural process to the chemical processes work in forming that nitrogen input.
And yeah, so you were saying about how hard it is to keep it in the soil. And I can imagine in whatever form it's in, nitrogen fertilizer, of course, is very reactive. It's people use it in explosives, so it's a very reactive substance. So you talked about how you have to space it out. And I understand the tilling process probably damages or releases a lot of that nitrogen as well. So it's released as gas. And I suppose the way it's utilized by the plants is there's some water soluble form that's absorbed. Does that ever get washed away, or is it mostly gassed into the atmosphere as for losses?
That's very good question. When you look at the nitrogen in different forms, there is a different efficiency use. For example, they use what they call urea as a dry granule. A lot of farmers, they spread it on the surface. And that's is going to be susceptible to loss because it's the temperature and the moisture. It's going to cause these chemical transformation of that nitrogen form into gases. Some of it will be released as a gas into what they call N2O, nitrous oxide, which is very potent to the atmosphere, or some of it will be leached because nitrate is very soluble. And when you have a lot of water moving over the ground or into the soil, it's going to leach that nitrogen deep in the soil profile. That's the reason we encourage farmers to split their nitrogen, not to put all the nitrogen. For example, if you need 150 pounds of nitrogen, you should at least split it 3-4 times. For example, you put 25 pounds with the seeds. When they started growing about 6 inches high, you put another 25 pounds and keep adding that. The reason that you spoon feed the crop, and people with irrigation, and that's a lot in Colorado, the center pivot and other states, you could feed it to the center pivot, to the sprinkler system, and that you could add it over time before what we call tasseling, before the crop start forming the grains. And that's basically is going to split the nitrogen, just like you're having 3 meals a day, and instead of having 1 meal for the whole day. So that's the analogy. So the split application of nitrogen. So if we mismanage that nitrogen in whatever form, whether liquid, grain, or gas injected, if we don't manage it properly, we got to increase the chance of releasing significant amount back to the air as the nitrous oxide gas. And that's the potential warming power of nitrous oxide, almost 300 times the CO2. That's the problem, how we manage nitrogen. The other form we lose in nitrogen, we said as a leaching, that's detriment to water quality. We leach it also when you have what we call non-aerobic condition, when you have saturated condition. And that's happened generally after heavy rain events or irrigation events. And if you have a lot of nitrogen in the field, most of this nitrogen, some of it will be leached, and a good percentage of it under these non-aerobic conditions will be transformed into gas, to nitrous oxide, and they will be released back into the air. So that's what we advise farmers: if they irrigate, don't over irrigate. If you need half an inch, put half an inch. And that will give you maximum efficiency of nitrogen use. Just a general rule of thumb, the nitrogen use efficiency used by the farmers in different settings, it doesn't exceed 50%. So there is potential loss almost 50% of what they apply. And that's a huge economically and environmentally. So that's what we encourage farmers to manage it more smart way to maximize the efficiency of nitrogen used by the plant.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big issue. The numbers I got for that is that about 5% of global natural gas and 2% then of all the energy that we use globally is used for creating these nitrogen fertilizers.
Right.
So any efficiency gain there
Yeah.
is very, very significant.
Right. And that's a big issue, because when you look at the percentage of contribution of different industry to greenhouse gas emission, the agriculture sector almost about 12%. And that include everything from manufacturing fertilizer to managing fertilizer on the ground.
Mhm. And then the potassium and phosphorus that you talked about as other inputs, those are mostly mined, right? And then just added to the soil.
Right. Yeah, rocks, processed and produced and used in different forms and different formulation of different fertilizers. What they call as a starter, they mix phosphorus and nitrogen, for example, to give the plants initial starts when they put the seeds in the ground. So that's basically formulation, but mostly the source of it, it's rock formation. And other kind of use, they use also what they call lime, calcium carbonate. That's basically to manage and change the pH from acidic to basic reaction in some areas when you have low pH. So they treat the soil with lime to bring the pH. Most of the plants, they need pH between 6.5 to 7 to operate optimally for nitrogen uptake and growth. So that's used significantly in the northern states with low pH.
Yeah, so none of that, I suppose, is sustainable. Maybe the calcium carbonate you can get from natural sources.
Right. Right. Yeah.
How about the runoff from fertilizers? And we haven't talked about pesticides. I don't really, especially want to get into that as a whole issue. And just the if you think about farmlands, it's often just flat, and they talk about runoff from fertilizers and the pesticides getting into the water systems, or freshwater systems, are being polluted by these agricultural practices. And yeah, I understand more or less how the water cycle works. It rains and then the water goes into the ground and gets to the water system. But so how does runoff and pollution occur in these processes, and do the natural processes mitigate that?
Well, it's really the surface runoff. It's associated generally with a few things. One, if you have high slope areas, and then the volume, whether rain or irrigation. So when you have high volume of water, coming down, whether from the sky or from equipment like center pivot, that water generate significant amount flow. And if that flow, that water coming down exceed the what we call the water intake or the infiltration of a certain soil, you're going to generate amount of runoff. That runoff is going to carry a lot of things, not just nitrogen, not just pesticide, not just organic matter, carry also sediments. And these sediments is going to end in ditches, rivers, and lakes, and that creates significant amount of problem. So when farmers, they use excess of nitrogen and there's excess of water, the drainage system, whether underground, some of it's going to go underground, connected to the mainstream rivers and lakes. So that will be carried to the water sources. So you see a lot of water carrying these nitrogen, but most of the runoff is going to carry significant amount of sediments, and these sediments is going to be carrying a lot of phosphorus with it, because phosphorus stays on the soil particles, and that will be carried with the surface runoff. So you see a lot of lakes if you go by, and when I used to live in Colorado, there is a little lake in close by there, go and look there, you see algae green growing on the top of the water. And that's basically encouraged by excess phosphorus from surface runoff. And that's suffocate the aquatic life, because it's gonna, most of the algae is gonna suffocate and absorb the oxygen from the water. Just like what happened in the Gulf of Mexico, when you have a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen, flow into that area, what they call the dead zone. And that's basically because the excess fertilizer flowing through the Mississippi River and goes all the way down to Gulf of Mexico. So the runoff, it's a bigger problem, and the controlling the runoff is through management practices. And especially bigger problem under natural condition in the northern tier states or in the Midwest, and how you drain that through, tile drains going through the field to take the excess water, at least reduce the sediment loss going through, going to the river, to the ditches. And one of the problems is for the counties, because most of these ditches managed by the counties. So they have to spend significant amount of money to clean up every season these ditches. And people, they are not aware of that. That's additional expense to the local government to take care of it. So it's a significant problem. And when you see, when I work in Colorado, there is basically deal with water quality and water management. We're trying to change the flood irrigation in most farms, especially in the Western slope, into sprinkler system or drip system, because the flood irrigation is notoriously use significant amount of water to reach the other end of the field. And that creates significant amount of runoff. And its efficiency about 40, 50%. So almost 60% of the water lost to runoff. So that's a big issue when you look at the water crisis we have in the West now. That we need to manage it more smartly.
Yeah, I live in Colorado, and I know a very significant percentage of the water goes towards agriculture here. So we've been talking about the soil in terms of the chemicals and the mineral composition of it, but it's also an ecosystem for living things, right? So I want to get an idea of both the macro and micro organisms that are living there, because that's really important as well to
Mhm.
just understanding what soil is and how it works, right? Everyone knows that the earthworms are important to the soil,
Right.
but maybe not exactly what they do or how they're important.
Yeah. Well, when you look really at the microbial community and macro community, it's essential for the ecosystem surfaces, the biodiversity these animals bring to the ecosystem for biological control, for nutrient cycling, for other surfaces, that's to give you a healthy and sustainable soil system. So when you have all these organic materials accumulated, over the growing season, whether in the natural non-managed system or in the managed agriculture system, forest and row crops and prairie systems, these animals play a significant role in building these microbial communities. And what they do, basically, there is a lot of diseases controlled biologically by different set of microbial communities, bacteria and fungi. And they are critical in recycling these organic materials. They are not usable for the plants by their own status unless you decompose these materials. And most of these microbial communities, they are specified in different tasks and different materials to break it down, whether lignin, cellulose, hemicellulose, all these is going to be break down by different microbial communities. You go on the macro level, you have the earthworms, for example. These are significant creatures boring down into the soil profile and taking these organic matter, creating this cast around their system, and that's very rich organic materials, contains significant amount of macro and micronutrients that will be break down, into mineral forms during the change of the season when you have, change in the temperature and the moisture. So when you look into that combination, the biodiversity, and that's when you look at the desert soil compared to well-balanced ecologically regions, moisture, temperature, and vegetation, you have a thriving community and thriving productivity. And that's what the soil health movement or regenerative agriculture trying to mimic and are trying to bring to, reinvigorate the soil system from abuse of tillage and chemicals to build it back into more natural system that could feed the microbial community and feed, the growing plants. Ultimately is going to help the humanity of providing plentiful food because of when the soil degrades, generally you will lose potential of productivity. And that's create a lot of food shortages and even social unrest in most of other countries who they are facing these issues. And if we want to build sustainable food system and food security for the projected population of 10 billion people by 2050, we better preserve that source because that's the only source we have. We are not going to generate more soil unless we protect what we have. So that's where the microbial biodiversity it plays a significant and essential role in balancing that. So to protect that microbial community, we need a diverse cropping system. We need diverse plant communities. And that's where it's give you that synergy between these different elements of the ecosystem.
So sticking with that global perspective, I've heard that many places, and from you a couple of times now, that our soil is essentially degrading, becoming less nutrient, having less nutrients, things like that. And I've heard from some people that this is an unsustainable, serious problem, maybe more serious than climate change. If we run out of a capacity to produce food from our soil, that's very serious. On the other hand, I've heard that it's not an issue because we're producing more and more food globally, and even the land that we do use is becoming more productive. I was just wondering if you could kind of integrate those two ideas for me, if one of them is right, or just give me a perspective on that.
Right, right. Yeah, I think if you look at the last few decades, we, with the modern agriculture, we contribute significantly to degrading our soil system. And when you degrade the soil system, and especially when you look at what they call small landholders, in the third world countries and the tropical and Africa and other countries, when you see the lack of resources and lack of prudent management practices or smart practices, that degrade the soil ability to produce food to sustain the population. That's one. So once the organic matter of the soil degraded because the extensive tillage, lack of biomass input, because when you have low productivity, you are not really feeding the soil as well. Because when you have excess productivity, biomass, you took the fruits, you took the grain, you leave that on the soil, you're going to feed the soil, cover the soil, protect it physically, and that's what's going to sustain the soil. The old model, which is the agricultural revolution model, focus on the productivity. Let's maximize and intensify the productivity by increasing the input, increasing fertilizer input. Forget about the environment for now. Set it aside. And that's what we got out of this. The global soil degradation, what we call the soil security. And soil security goes along with the food security. They are two equal each other. If you don't have a soil security that functionally resilient, it has capacity to produce, it's sustainable, it's accessible, you cannot have a secure food to feed these populations. So the old model that's modern agriculture alone and the agricultural revolution is going to take care of that. I think the agriculture industry has a responsibility to change their view and their agenda by integrating the soil health, regenerative agriculture within their own system. And that's become a goal for sustaining these resources and not just intensifying and maximizing productivity by all means. We need to balance that with the ecological concept. Nature is telling us something, because to combat the climate change, to combat the extremes, we need a resilient soil system to withstand this kind of assault. And that is not going to happen unless we have a balanced system. I'm glad to see a lot of agriculture industries raising the flag of sustainability, and I don't know if that's a sincere goal, and that should be as a part of their agenda to sustain that model. We need a new model for agriculture. The old model, it didn't protect the soil, and we have a new challenge. And unless we change our thinking to transformative way of building agriculture production, we're going to repeat the same mistakes.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask the question about future work, future research, where you see this going, and that pretty well answers it. Do you see any like maybe specific things, specific research that you're hopeful about that either you're doing or you see people doing that you think is something new, something to really look into?
Well, it's really there is a lot of momentum really for agricultural research or natural research at large, given the climate attention, on the national level and the funding for the climate issues. That's very encouraging. And that's what we need to accelerate the application of these. We have a lot of science, Matt, on the book related to climate smart agriculture research, regenerative agriculture. The question is, we need to have a commitment to large scale application. You cannot decouple climate change from food security. And that's what needs to be the overriding goal, that we need to develop our research to support not just only the economic side, but the climate side effect. So you need to merge the climate with the economic. And that's what sustainability all about. It's to create that a new thinking for building a new way of production. And that's being creating incentive for the farmers to adapt new practices, which is any new practice is going to take time and it's going to take some learning curve. So at the meantime, you need to support the farmers. And that's what the new farm bill currently negotiated for 2023. That's what we need, a new thinking to really implement aggressive agenda for conservation and work with the farmers to implement it, and stop half measure approach. And the industry need to be integrated in the responsibility. You cannot just sell a product. You need to be part of the solution as well. So that's my hope. It's to have a national agenda that's collaborative between different players, farmers, scientists, corporate, private sector, work together to solve these challenges.
Okay, that's pretty good. I have just a few questions to kind of go back in, just to pick up a few things that I wasn't able to integrate into the. So I had a question about livestock or agricultural land used for livestock versus for crops. And the numbers I got is like 77% of land that we say is used for agriculture is used for supporting livestock. Of course, the livestock is a big part of our diet, and we need to fuel that. But I've also heard that some land isn't fit for growing the kind of crops that we grow for ourselves, and really it's just the livestock that can utilize that land anyway. So it's not like we're sacrificing food that we would eat to the livestock. It's more that we're supplementing land that wouldn't be used otherwise with livestock. And I was just wondering how true that is.
Well, yeah, when you look at the livestock production in the old days, it's far really integrated. Farmers grow livestock and grow cash crops on the same land. They grow the crops and then the livestock is growing, after harvest, feeding on the residue. So there is integration and there is value in that. So that's because animals is a critical component of the ecosystem, whether large animals or small animals. The byproducts of these animals is going to feed into the soil system, adding more organic compounds and byproducts, and that's going to rejuvenate and build the system. There is a different lands, which is basically we separated that. You have the grazing land, for example, and that's generally you see it in the West. And I lived in Colorado, you see big areas, raising livestock in different areas and federal land and state lands. So these lands, it's more suitable for grazing and raising livestock because of the nature of these land formation. You cannot grow crops efficiently and effectively to put the energy and the production on these land, really, and that's more suitable for livestock. But that doesn't negate the fact that farmers need to rethink their models if they have room to grow livestock into their regular farming, practices. And there's a lot of farmers doing that. They have livestock and they have, growing row crops in the same time. So that model actually it's beneficial, and the livestock integration is declined significantly in the current years within the farm land. So it's become very small amount of number of farmers really raising cows along with raising crops. So that model needs to be revisited. That's, I think, need to be encouraged, because that is going to require some support also for the farmers. I mean, farmers, they do what they do. It's because really that's their way of life. And they love what they do, and they are in business and make a living there. So I think to sustain the land and the productivity, food security for future generation, I think on the national level, we need to step up and set help through the Farm Bill, other issues to integrate these new management and new ideas into really building integrated system.
Do small farms do this integration better, do you think, than these large industrial scale? Or, well, first, do they do it better? And then is there a way to do this integration at an industrial scale, or is it just a lot of logistics?
Well, the industrial scale, they have a different model. You see the confined animal operations. I see that in Colorado by Greeley and other areas. You have got hundreds of thousands of cows and spread 5-6 miles in feedlots. That's a different model. But when you look at the managing the land, I think small farmers to integrate these animals into the production system is going to do much better job managing these animals and move them to different parts of the farm, not just for the value of producing meat or milk otherwise, but also for regenerating the agriculture land and protect it. So the industrial model is really not about building the soil and regenerating the soil. It's industrial protection model. They're going to produce meat or whatever the goal of their operation, and that's a business large scale model. Within the farmers, it's become part of their production system to protect, their soil, become steward of that land. So you will see more ecologically, you will have more benefits coming from that.
Yeah, I think it's important, to understand that the
Yeah.
ecosystem on a macro scale involves these
Right.
large livestock animals. Yeah, and just the way we manage them, it should be
Right.
closer to the way that they are naturally good. Okay, I have one more question. It's sort of about my personal situation here. I have a garden in the back, and I've been gardening for a few years now, and I built a compost pile. So I mulch, I put all my yard waste into the compost pile and, get it composted through that reaction and then mix that into the garden. And I'm just wondering if I should just put all the compost, put the mulch on top of my garden and just let it, do
Yeah.
what we were talking about before. If that's a better method for gardening.
Yeah. Actually, because think about it this way, man. When you go and you get a potting soil from the store, you get a bag of potting soil, you put it in there. This is all organic matter.
Yeah.
It's compost. And you go grow plants, you put it in the pot and you put a plant in it. And you grow tomatoes or you grow whatever. You could do the same thing. You build a box on the top of your soil and put the compost there and use it. That's going to help build, the organic materials, and that's going to break down over the heat in Colorado. Is going to, break it down, and you water every time you're going to break it down. You have all the night crawls will be coming out, and I wouldn't bother even to mix it.
Do you have anything else you want to say? Any projects, websites you want to promote?
If people interested, I establish a consulting business that's related to soil carbon metrics. And that's basically to provide consultation for people who they are interested and they need technical help in the area what we talked about about soil and climate, productivity and greenhouse gas and organic matter, any other issues on the technical side of it. If they are interested, they could find me and give me a call, and I'll be glad to help them in any way possible. I appreciate the opportunity, Matt, and I hope this discussion of help to you and your goals and your podcast.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for your time and your
Yeah.
expertise.